When I moved into the quiet cul-de-sac of Red Maple Lane, I genuinely believed I'd stumbled onto a suburban paradise. The houses, each meticulously trimmed in pastel shades, lined up along a curved street dotted with flowering trees. Families walked their dogs, children rode bikes, and weekend barbecues wafted savory smoke into the languid summer air. I was thrilled to finally own a cozy, single-story home that came complete with a fenced-in backyard and a modest storage shed, perfect for stashing everything from gardening tools to boxes of old family photos. I'd spent months saving for the down payment and scouring listings for something that felt safe, comfortable, and just large enough to build a life of my own. Little did I suspect that Red Maple Lane harbored a deep secret. The neighborhood was practically ruled by an overzealous homeowners association. And at the helm of that HOA was Helen Armbruster, known privately by everyone else as Karen. She was a woman in her late 40s or early 50s, with hair dyed a perfect caramel blonde and a penchant for crisp linen pantsuits in every color. Her posture was always immaculate, her voice cultured, her presence imposing. One glance at her unwavering eye contact told you she meant business. Her business, specifically. It was only my second day of living there when Karen first made her appearance on my doorstep. She greeted me with the barest of smiles and a welcome basket, while slipping in a not-so-subtle mention of the strict HOA standards. I remember her precise words. "We at Red Maple Lane take pride in our uniformity and decorum. I trust you'll uphold our standards." I thought nothing of it at the time. Plenty of neighborhoods have HOAs, after all. But the real issues began a few weeks later, triggered by the unassuming presence of my humble backyard shed. My storage shed wasn't anything fancy, just a simple structure, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with an A-frame roof and painted wooden siding. The previous owner had built it to store lawn equipment. He left behind some shelves, a workbench, and a couple of hooks in the rafters for hanging tools. I found it charming and practical. For Karen, however, the shed was apparently an eyesore, or at least, that's what she implied whenever she passed by and saw me tidying it up. One morning, I heard her distinct, clipped voice from across the fence, asking if I planned to comply with architectural guidelines regarding outbuildings. I politely told her that the structure had been there for years, that it was part of the property, and that I had no intention of changing it, unless the HOA required me to. She responded with a vague, "We'll see," and disappeared around the corner of her house. At the time, I suspected she'd just wanted to reassert her authority. Over the next few weeks, though, I caught glimpses of Karen hovering near my fence whenever I was in the backyard. Sometimes she would pretend to sweep her patio or trim her hedges. Other times, she'd stand blatantly and watch me through the pickets. If I turned to meet her gaze, she'd scuttle away as though she hadn't been watching at all. I should have found it unnerving, but it was easy to chalk up to typical HOA micromanagement. I'd heard the stories. Neighbors complaining about the color of a front door or the length of the grass. I assumed this was more of the same. Still, I had no idea just how far Karen was willing to go to enforce her version of compliance. It started with small whispers that drifted back to me through the neighborhood grapevine. A neighbor 2 doors down, Shannon, approached me hesitantly at the mailbox one morning. She said, "I don't mean to pry, but Karen, has been telling people you might be storing questionable things in your shed." I stared at Shannon, baffled. Questionable things? Shannon blushed. She mentioned something about contraband. I don't know if she used the word drugs explicitly, but she implied it. I laughed at the absurdity. My shed contained nothing more controversial than a lawnmower, a leaf blower, some old boxes of clothes, and a couple of unopened holiday decoration bins. Why would anyone think I'm hiding contraband? Shannon shrugged, looking relieved that I wasn't angry at her for delivering the news. "You know how Karen is. She said she saw you moving boxes in there late at night once, and she's convinced you're up to something illegal." It took me a moment to process. The late at night event in question likely referred to the weekend I'd been reorganizing some boxes after dinner. Around 8:30 p.m., hardly the hour of clandestine crimes, but evidently late enough for Karen to spin up her own theories. I thanked Shannon for telling me, but inside I was unsettled. Why would Karen jump to such an extreme conclusion? More importantly, what was she planning to do about it? A week later, I found myself face to face with Karen again, this time at my front door. She showed up unannounced, wearing that perpetually smug expression that seemed to say, "I know more about your wrongdoing than you do." "Good morning, dear," she said in that almost sarcastic sweetness. "I understand you've been storing some items in your backyard shed." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean my holiday decorations and yard tools?" She didn't laugh or smile. "We have a policy in Red Maple Lane about unsightly or dangerous materials. Some neighbors claim you've been keeping suspicious things in there. If you don't mind, I'd like to inspect the interior to ensure it meets HOA guidelines." My shock momentarily rendered me speechless. Finally, I found my voice. "Inspect my shed? You have no right to enter my property without my permission, especially not just because of rumors." Karen bristled. "I'm on the HOA board, specifically handling compliance and safety. It would be far better for both of us if you simply cooperated. Show me you have nothing illegal in there, and we can lay these rumors to rest." I realized, with a slow, burning anger, that she genuinely believed I'd cave. She thought I would fling the doors wide open, letting her rummage through my personal belongings. I felt a surge of indignation rise in my chest. "I'm sorry, Karen," I said, my voice cool, "but I don't consent to any unauthorized searches of my property. If the HOA wants to see the shed, they can issue a formal request or go through legal channels. You are not the police." She gave me a frosty glare and turned on her heel, marching back down the sidewalk. Over her shoulder, she tossed one final remark. "We'll see how cooperative you are when the HOA board steps in." I shut the door, heart pounding. Something told me this was only the beginning of Karen's intrusive campaign. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Karen would escalate matters. That day, after stewing in anxious anger for a while, I headed to the local hardware store. I picked up a couple of basic surveillance cameras, outdoor models with motion sensors and night vision. Installing them took some doing, but by dusk, I had one camera aimed at my shed door and another covering the side gate entrance. I wasn't entirely sure if I was being paranoid, but stories of Karen's meddling were plentiful in the neighborhood. People whispered she'd once trespassed onto someone's patio to photograph unauthorized landscaping. Another rumor suggested she let herself into a neighbor's backyard to check if their dog kennel violated size regulations. It seemed that boundaries meant little to her. Now that she was convinced I kept illegal items in the shed, it was only a matter of time before she tried something drastic. As I tested the camera feeds on my phone that night, I told myself maybe I was over-preparing. At the same time, a quiet part of me insisted, better safe than sorry. Within days, that little voice would prove itself right. Sure enough, just a week after installing the cameras, I came home from a short errand run one afternoon to find something unsettling. The padlock on my shed door hung crookedly, as if tampered with. Drawing closer, I realized the metal clasp had been forced open. It wasn't broken entirely, but it had been damaged to the point where the lock was no longer secure. My heart sank. I yanked the door open and peered inside. Several boxes had been moved around. My lawnmower was shifted off to the side, and a few of my personal items, like a shoebox of old letters, had been upended on the workbench. It was as though someone had rifled through them in a hurry. Shaken, I immediately checked my phone to access the live feed of my cameras. Sure enough, I had a motion alert timestamp just over an hour ago. My stomach twisted as I scrolled to watch the recorded footage. The camera angle was clear. It showed Karen sneaking through my side gate, checking over her shoulder, and then walking straight up to the shed door. With astonishing boldness, she took out a small tool from her handbag, maybe a screwdriver or a pry bar, and jimmied the lock until it gave way. I watched, incredulous, as she disappeared inside for several minutes. Then she emerged, adjusting her blouse and muttering something under her breath. She even looked directly at the camera once, though the angle suggested she might not have noticed it. Finally, she scurried back out the gate, leaving it ajar behind her. A swirl of emotions churned in my chest. Anger, violation, disbelief. She had truly crossed the line, committing outright trespassing and property damage. All because she suspected me of storing contraband? It was insane. Yet I had the undeniable proof right there on my phone. My initial instinct was to storm over to Karen's house and confront her. I envisioned pounding on her door, thrusting my phone in her face, and demanding an explanation for her intrusion. But reason got the better of me. If Karen was willing to break into my shed, she was capable of further escalation. I needed to protect myself legally. I called the non-emergency police line to ask for advice. The dispatcher listened attentively, then told me to gather all evidence, video footage, photos of damage, and file a police report. They could guide me through pressing charges if I chose to. Next, I took pictures of the prime marks on the door frame and the damaged padlock. Then I photographed the disarray inside, boxes strewn about, items knocked to the floor. I even recorded my own walkthrough of the shed, narrating the changes in case I needed a detailed record of exactly how it looked after the break-in. Finally, I saved multiple copies of the camera footage, one on an external hard drive, one in cloud storage, and one on my phone. Karen was on the HOA board, but that didn't mean she was above the law. Once I felt prepared, I dialed the HOA's main phone line to leave a message for the board's president, explaining I had an urgent matter of trespassing involving a member of the board. I kept my tone polite, but the subtext was clear. Your star compliance officer just committed a crime. Within 24 hours, the HOA president, Mr. Williams, called me back. He sounded both concerned and weary, as though he'd dealt with Karen's antics more than once. I'm sorry this happened, he said. If you could send me that footage, I'll present it to the rest of the board. This is a serious issue, especially if it's true that Karen, broke in without permission. I emailed him a link to the video file along with a brief written statement detailing the damage I found. Not long afterward, he replied, promising that the incident would be reviewed at a special HOA meeting. In the meantime, he recommended I consider filing a police report, which I did that same afternoon. The officers who took my statement seemed taken aback by Karen's brazenness. One officer mentioned that if the shed was locked, we were looking at a potential burglary charge, even if nothing was stolen. Just the act of forcibly entering a locked structure was significant. Simultaneously, I learned that Karen's alleged evidence of contraband was nowhere to be found, because, of course, there was none. She couldn't prove something that didn't exist. Yet she had taken the risk to physically break in, which spoke to her twisted sense of authority. I felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, relief that I had proof, anger at her invasion, and a certain anxious thrill that justice might finally come from her unbridled arrogance. As I waited for the special HOA meeting to be scheduled, I tried to go about my daily life, though a constant knot of tension resided in my stomach. The special HOA board meeting took place on a Wednesday evening in the neighborhood clubhouse, a modest building with folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and a long table at the front. Usually, these meetings discussed issues like landscaping budgets and community events. But on this occasion, the agenda was overshadowed by incident of unauthorized shed entry. I arrived early, laptop in tow, ready to share my video footage if needed. Karen was also there, standing near the refreshments table, sipping from a foam cup of coffee. She refused to look at me. Instead, she spoke in hushed tones with a few of her close allies, Ms. Bergstrom, who oversaw the community newsletter, and Mr. Levy, who managed the neighborhood watch. When the board finally called the meeting to order, Mr. Williams cleared his throat. We have an urgent matter to discuss. There's been an accusation that a member of this board, Ms. Helen Armbruster, entered another homeowner's property without authorization, specifically a locked shed. I raised my hand, and Mr. Williams nodded at me. Keeping my voice steady, I presented a short statement. I have video proof that Ms. Armbruster forced open my shed lock and rummaged through my belongings on the afternoon of July 10th. This not only constitutes trespassing, but also property damage. I reported it to the police. Here is the footage. I plugged my phone into the board's laptop, and the short clip played on a modest overhead screen. As Karen's figure appeared, prying the lock, a collective gasp spread through the room. No one, aside from her staunchest supporters, could deny the evidence. Karen, forced to respond, stammered out a defense. I had credible information suggesting there were prohibited materials in that shed. As the HOA compliance officer, I felt it my duty to ensure the safety of our community. We have children here, elderly people. I was worried about potential dangers. Even Ms. Bergstrom looked uneasy. Mr. Williams pressed further. Why not contact the authorities first if you suspected illegal activity? Or at least get a warrant if you truly believe there was a crime involved. Karen bristled. I didn't think it would be a big deal to take a quick look. And if I found something, I would have notified the police. I was acting in good faith. The tension in the room was palpable. If she'd been expecting support or applause, she got none. An undercurrent of murmurs suggested that the board recognized she had gone too far. "I'd like to remind everyone," I said calmly, "that the police are already involved, and I'm considering pressing charges. My privacy and property rights were violated without cause." Karen's face burned red with indignation. She opened her mouth to retort, but Mr. Williams held up a hand. "We'll deliberate on this privately and then inform you both of our decision." Following the meeting, Karen didn't try to approach me. Instead, she funneled her energies into rallying a small faction of neighbors behind her. I heard rumors that she was painting herself as a misunderstood hero, someone who was only trying to protect the neighborhood from a supposed drug den or weapons cache in my shed. Some neighbors, especially those who had known her for years, wavered in their judgment. They couldn't fathom that Karen might have fabricated the entire excuse. One afternoon, Ms. Bergstrom, perhaps feeling guilty, knocked on my door. She said she wanted to hear my side in detail. I obliged, showing her the photos of my broken lock and the state of my rummaged belongings. We watched the surveillance footage again, in which Karen clearly forced the door. Ms. Bergstrom sighed. "She told me you had stockpiles of chemicals in there, and that you might be running some sort of, well, I don't even want to repeat it." I rolled my eyes. "Take a look yourself if you want. It's just seasonal decorations, boxes, and a lawnmower." To her credit, Ms. Bergstrom accepted my invitation to peek inside the shed. She saw nothing but mundane household items. As we stepped out, she looked genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry. I really believed Helen was looking out for us. This is just uncalled for." I nodded. "I appreciate you taking the time to check. I don't hold a grudge against you personally." But she crossed a line. Word spread that Karen had lied or, at minimum, grossly exaggerated. A subtle shift in neighborhood sentiment began. People who once admired her dedication started questioning her methods. A few even joked in whispered tones that Karen would soon be searching attics or basements, looking for non-existent criminals. Despite her best efforts, Karen's credibility waned rapidly. As if the internal HOA investigation wasn't enough, the local police moved forward with their own process once they reviewed my footage. An officer called me in for a formal interview, during which I provided a detailed statement. They clarified that while burglary typically requires an intent to steal, the forced entry of a locked structure could still be prosecuted as criminal trespass or even burglary of an unoccupied building under state law, depending on the district attorney's assessment. This was serious. Karen, if charged and found guilty, could face fines or even potential jail time. That fact weighed heavily on me. I had no desire to see a neighbor behind bars. Yet I also knew I couldn't simply let such a violation slide. What if she tried it again with someone else? What if she escalated her behavior further down the line? The officer explained my rights. I could press charges, or I could let the district attorney decide how to proceed based on the video evidence and the circumstances. Ultimately, I told them I'd cooperate fully with whatever the prosecutor recommended. I signed the necessary paperwork, feeling both vindicated and conflicted. News of the police investigation got around. A hush seemed to settle over Red Maple Lane. People whispered about how the incident might end with Karen arrested. Some neighbors avoided talking about it, perhaps hoping it would blow over. But the wheels of justice had already begun turning. The HOA board called me back in for a private session after about 2 weeks. Karen, notably, was not invited to attend. Mr. Williams greeted me in the small conference room with a weary smile. "We've been reviewing the footage, plus statements from you and from Ms. Armbruster. The board has also heard from other residents about the pattern of her intrusive actions." I sat down at a long table facing 4 members, Mr. Williams, Ms. Carter, Mr. Douglas, and Ms. Peterson. They all looked tired, as though this situation had weighed on them as well. Mr. Williams spoke. "It seems clear that Ms. Armbruster acted far beyond the scope of any HOA compliance responsibilities. Even if she suspected wrongdoing, the proper procedure would have been to contact local law enforcement, not break into your shed. She's created a liability for the HOA and a breach of trust with you." Ms. Carter nodded. "We realize you might pursue legal action, or the police might. But from the HOA's standpoint, we want to inform you that we will be imposing sanctions on Ms. Armbruster for unauthorized trespassing and for conducting an unauthorized inspection. She had no board approval to do so." I blinked, a touch of relief washing over me. "Sanctions? Meaning what exactly?" Miss Peterson answered. We can't fire her from the board. She was elected by the membership. But we can strip her of her compliance officer role, effective immediately. She'll also face a substantial fine for property damage and for violating HOA guidelines about respecting homeowner privacy," Mr. Douglas added. "Additionally, we plan to require a written apology from her to be read publicly at the next HOA meeting. We hope that addresses some of the harm done. We also want to assure you that your shed is entirely your private property." My shoulders eased. "Thank you. I appreciate the HOA taking this seriously. I do want to clarify, I'm not storing anything illegal. This was all based on baseless rumors Karen circulated." They exchanged glances. Mr. Williams spoke gently. "We understand, and we're truly sorry you've had to endure this. We'll do what we can to make sure it doesn't happen again." I left that meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. While this didn't remove the possibility of legal repercussions for Karen, it certainly addressed her overreach within the HOA's domain. Maybe, just maybe, it would curb her behavior. The next HOA meeting arrived on a muggy Thursday evening. Despite the uncomfortable humidity, the turnout was larger than usual. Word had spread that Karen was to issue a public apology. Many residents were eager to witness the moment, given her longtime reign as the unstoppable compliance queen. I found a seat near the back, laptop on my knees, feeling a mixture of anticipation and unease. Karen walked in a few minutes later, looking distinctly subdued in a beige cardigan, her hair pinned back without its usual precision. She avoided eye contact, though I could sense her anger radiating. Mr. Williams opened the meeting, addressing standard items on the agenda first: a new landscaping contract, upcoming social events, and a minor budget reallocation. The tension was palpable as everyone waited for the main event. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Before we adjourn, there is one final matter. Ms. Armbruster has a statement to read." Karen approached the front with a piece of paper in hand. Her voice was taut, and her eyes flitted nervously over the crowd. I would like to apologize," she began. Her tone was mechanical, as though each word were being forced out. "To the residents of Red Maple Lane, and specifically to," she glanced at me, face tightening, "to Ms. Evans, for my actions regarding her backyard shed. I acknowledge that I acted outside the bounds of my authority as an HOA compliance officer. My entry into her locked storage space was unauthorized, and I regret any distress or inconvenience caused." Silence hung in the room. No one clapped or offered sympathy. A few cleared their throats uncomfortably. Karen continued, "It was never my intent to cause harm. I only sought to ensure neighborhood safety. However, I understand I should have followed proper protocols. For that, I accept the disciplinary actions imposed by the board." Her apology ended as abruptly as it started. She stepped away from the podium, face flushed, and returned to her seat. I couldn't help noticing that she didn't look at me once. Nonetheless, the apology was on record, officially acknowledging her wrongdoing. After the meeting adjourned, a few neighbors approached me, offering kind words. Some quietly expressed relief that Karen's influence had finally been curtailed. No one seemed eager to defend her publicly anymore. She left the clubhouse quickly, avoiding further conversation. Even after Karen's public apology and demotion within the HOA, the question of legal consequences lingered. I received a call from the district attorney's office, asking if I wanted to formally press charges for criminal trespass or burglary. They explained that they had enough evidence to proceed, but also understood if I preferred a more lenient approach. For days, I wrestled with the decision. Karen's apology had felt forced, but it was still an admission of wrongdoing. The HOA fine and her loss of authority were already significant punishments. Part of me wanted to see her pay in a court of law, if only to show bullies everywhere that they can't trample on people's rights. Another part of me felt conflicted. Did I really want to push for a criminal record for a neighbor, no matter how irritating and invasive? I spoke with a local attorney for advice. He pointed out that pressing charges could become a lengthy, stressful process. If the case went to trial, I'd have to testify, potentially face cross-examination, and Karen might attempt to spin the story in her favor. While the evidence was strongly on my side, it wouldn't be a smooth or quick ordeal. In the end, I decided not to push for the harshest charges. I informed the district attorney that I was satisfied with the outcome at the HOA level, combined with the possibility of lesser misdemeanor trespassing charges if Karen didn't comply with the existing sanctions. They indicated they'd keep the file open for a while, in case Karen reoffended or if I changed my mind. My choice was driven by a desire for peace. As far as I could see, Karen had already lost her main source of neighborhood power. Perhaps that alone would deter her from future meddling. Time would tell. With the legal matters mostly settled, I turned my attention to reclaiming my personal space, my shed. Replacing the damaged lock was the first step. I upgraded it to a sturdier padlock with a reinforced metal latch and a hidden shackle design that would be much tougher to pry open. I also installed a battery-powered motion sensor light on the shed's exterior, which switched on whenever someone approached. Inside, I reorganized the entire layout. I purchased new plastic storage bins for my off-season clothes, holiday decorations, and childhood memorabilia. I swept the floor, wiped down the shelves, and even hung a few motivational posters, partly as a whimsical statement that said, "This is my space, and no one intrudes without my permission." Finally, I added a second camera inside the shed, discreetly placed near the rafters so any future trespassers would be clearly visible. It was probably overkill, but after enduring such a violation of privacy, I wasn't taking chances. Strangely enough, the process felt empowering. The shed, once a target of Karen's suspicion, was now a symbol of my right to privacy and security. I was determined never to let anyone bully me out of that right again. With the dust settling, I began to notice a subtle shift in how neighbors interacted with me. Some had initially been standoffish, perhaps uncertain whether Karen's rumors were true or not. But after the public spectacle of her apology, many warmed up significantly. I started getting friendly waves as I strolled down the street. A few people stopped by with homemade cookies or offers to help me replant the flower beds by my porch. Shannon, the neighbor who'd first warned me about Karen's gossip, became a close confidant. She joked that I'd gone toe-to-toe with the HOA tyrant and come out victorious. I laughed, though I also reminded her it had been a stressful journey. Still, the camaraderie I felt with those who'd supported me was gratifying. Karen herself became noticeably scarce. I rarely saw her outside anymore, and when I did, she'd quickly move indoors or turn away to avoid eye contact. Her once frequent yard inspections and compliance visits all but disappeared. I suspected the public humiliation had wounded her pride deeply. No longer was she the de facto commander of everyone else's property. To me, that quiet was golden. Peace had returned to Red Maple Lane, at least for the time being. One late afternoon, a few weeks after the HOA meeting, I was cleaning out my car when I noticed Karen's silver sedan creeping down the street. She pulled up in front of my house and idled for a moment. I pretended not to notice, focusing on vacuuming the back seat. Eventually, she turned off the engine and got out. My pulse quickened. Was she about to launch another confrontation? The memory of her trespassing still stung. But as she approached, I saw she looked unusually subdued. No harsh lines in her brow, no scowl on her lips. "Hello," she said quietly. I stood upright, shutting the vacuum off. "Hi, Karen." She folded her hands. "I just wanted to tell you that I've paid the HOA fine. And her gaze flickered over the house. "I'm stepping down from the compliance committee." Completely. I nodded, uncertain how to respond. "Okay, I hope that helps you move forward." She hesitated, as if there was more she wanted to say. But then she just managed a stiff nod, eyes clouded with unreadable emotion, and turned away. Without another word, she returned to her car and drove off. As I watched her sedan disappear around the corner, I felt a tangle of emotions: relief, lingering bitterness, a touch of pity. Maybe in her own warped way, she'd been trying to do what she believed was right. Her methods were certainly unacceptable, but at least now she seemed to recognize that. I wasn't sure if we'd ever have a genuine conversation about it. But for the first time, I sensed Karen was grappling with the magnitude of her actions. Life on Red Maple Lane stabilized into a pleasant routine once more. The sun rose on neat lawns and quiet streets. Neighbors chatted amiably, sharing gardening tips or discussing the latest community news. Without Karen's constant oversight, the vibe felt friendlier, more relaxed. People seemed less afraid of being reported for minor infractions. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of Karen driving by or stepping out to retrieve her mail. She kept her head down, as though trying not to draw attention. Though I wouldn't say we were friends. Far from it. We no longer existed in open conflict. The memory of her breaking into my shed still lingered like a bruise, but at least the everyday tension was gone. To my surprise, Mr. Williams asked if I'd consider volunteering for a newly formed HOA subcommittee focused on hosting neighborhood events rather than policing aesthetics. "We need folks who believe in building community," he said. "After everything that happened, I think you'd bring a fresh perspective." I agreed, wanting to foster a more supportive atmosphere in the place I now called home. We organized small block parties, a monthly game night at the clubhouse, and even a community garden initiative in one of the unused common areas. Over time, a spirit of collaboration replaced the old climate of fear and suspicion. When I walked past my shed each day, its new lock gleaming under the sun, I felt a quiet surge of pride. It symbolized the battle I'd faced and won, standing up for my property rights against someone who believed she was above the law. Months turned into a year, and the story of Karen's break-in became neighborhood lore. People referred to it jokingly as the Great Shed Caper, though the incident was no laughing matter at the time. The lesson, however, remained powerful. Even in a seemingly perfect suburban enclave, boundaries matter. And no one, not even an HOA board member, can override the law or a homeowner's basic rights without consequence. Karen, stripped of her compliance powers, eventually resigned from her board position entirely. Rumor had it she considered moving, but as far as I knew, she stayed put in her same house, her flamboyant authority replaced by a subdued presence. Occasionally, a neighbor saw her at the grocery store, but she no longer roamed the streets with a notepad, searching for infractions. For my part, I found a sense of calm in Red Maple Lane. The community events I helped organize brought me closer to neighbors who once were strangers. I felt more rooted than ever in my home, my fence lines, and yes, my trusty shed. I also remained cautious. I kept the cameras around, including the one inside the shed. Perhaps it was a lingering vestige of trauma, but I preferred the reassurance of having that record. If anyone, Karen or otherwise, tried something similar, they'd face a mountain of evidence. Yet, I didn't live in constant fear. The intensity of Karen's actions had passed, and in its place was the knowledge that I had taken the correct steps to protect myself. I'd confronted the situation rationally, gathered evidence, followed legal channels, and even shown restraint in not pushing for the harshest charges. That day I reorganized the shed, I placed a small sign inside, a whimsical piece of decor that read, "This is my happy place." Though intended as a playful nod to the joys of gardening and DIY projects, it also reminded me each time I went in that I refused to be a victim of someone else's paranoia and aggression. In the end, Karen's trespassing spree had an outcome she never intended. It galvanized the neighborhood to adopt a more communal, less punitive approach. It brought neighbors together in solidarity, reminding us that an HOA should serve the community, not rule it with an iron fist. And for me, personally, it taught an invaluable lesson. Standing up to intimidation isn't just a matter of personal pride, it's a right and responsibility. My shed may be a small structure on a suburban lot, but it's also a symbol of privacy, security, and the personal space we're all entitled to. And if Karen or anyone else tries to violate that again, well, my cameras and the law are ready. Long after the dust settled, I sometimes found myself smiling wryly at the irony of it all. Karen had gone looking for illegal items in my shed, hoping to unearth some grand scandal or justify her draconian approach to neighborhood management. Instead, all she discovered was how quickly the community and the law would rally to protect the victim rather than the trespasser. The final result was, in a strange way, transformative for Red Maple Lane. The HOA, once dominated by a single personality, became more balanced. The board introduced clearer guidelines on what members could and could not do regarding private property. They also made it easier for residents to voice concerns anonymously if they felt bullied or harassed by anyone in the community. Karen herself faded into the background, dethroned from her self-anointed status. Though I'll likely never trust her fully, I harbor a cautious hope that this experience might have humbled her, perhaps made her reconsider the difference between genuine community service and meddlesome overreach. As for me, each time I open the door to my shed, whether to fetch a lawnmower or grab a box of holiday lights, I feel a sense of quiet triumph. I won't forget the intrusion, but neither will I let it define me. My life on Red Maple Lane continues, enriched by new friendships and strengthened by adversity overcome. Sometimes, challenge births community. And sometimes, the biggest bullies fall hardest when confronted by simple truths and straightforward evidence. My shed stands as a permanent reminder of that fact, a small wooden building with a sturdy new lock, extra cameras, and a sign proclaiming that this space, and all it represents, is off-limits to trespassers. And so, under the gentle canopy of the red maple trees, a new spirit of cooperation prevails, leaving behind the days when one Karen believed she had the right to barge into someone else's world. I wouldn't say everything is perfect. No place ever is. But it's ours, and we'll protect it together.